Hello, good evening. Thank you again for joining us. Myself and Mark are going to be taking you through a few questions and answers that we've prepared that have come in from the technical helpline. Speaking of technical helpline, Mark, how's it been last week? I know you've had obviously the weekend off, but previous to that, how was the rest of the week from the last time that we saw these guys?
Yeah, well, pretty busy. I mean, the calls have been increasing sort of day on day, and it's like we've never been away from it, to be honest. But plenty of calls coming through. Some of those on the current, legislation to do with the private rented sector, as I said before. There's still the old favourite questions on bonding on blocks of flats, and
Yeah,
the types of what code do I give a fuse board that hasn't got any RCD protection? So there's quite a lot of the usual favourites coming in. Plus, we're getting a few kind of design questions asked, which we can answer them, but not specifically with a design answer, because we don't get involved with design per se, but we can give plenty of guidance.
yeah, no, that's for obvious reasons that we can't, get involved in the design aspect of things because the contractor will go out and then say, well, the NIC told me to do it this way, and if our guidance is not deemed to have been completely 100% technically accurate, we could be then liable for it.
Sure.
Um, that was a football weekend. Amazing
Yeah,
results.
pretty good. I mean, Liverpool got absolutely trounced, didn't they, with their seven goals. Tottenham did pretty well for a change, so
Yeah,
that was good.
let's mention that. Let's mention the fact that United got trounced as well. Very very happy on a Sunday, and I had a lovely roast cooked by my partner as well. So even a proper Sunday for me. Um,
Good.
we're going to go into some of the questions. If a few people are mentioning here just laughing at Liverpool and X amount, somebody's already asked the question, Mark. So we'll start and jump into theirs. Hi there. I want to ask a question. Can I use aluminium, not copper, main cable for a 100 amp isolator to a consumer unit?
Aluminium conductor.
Yeah.
I mean, the conductors there are tables for current capacities for conductors in the regs book. Um, there there could be issues around connecting two dissimilar metals, so you'd have to check, because there might be specific connections required where you're using aluminium cables.
Mhm.
Um, and the required proprietary sort of terminations for that as well. So absolutely, but they'll need to check the tables in the regs and check with the manufacturer of the cable, possibly.
Okay. I think Mr. Collins wants to get involved because he seems to be answering all my questions and doing my job for me.
Right.
Somebody said with the PRS scheme and the current local lockdowns, will the April deadline be extended for EICRs due to access to properties?
That's a good question, Mr. Collins, but
It wasn't
I'm,
actually Mr.
I'm
Collins that answered it. It was another guy, but he replied to him already. So,
all
um,
right.
yeah. Sorry, carry on.
So yeah, I'm not able to answer that at the moment. We're waiting for guidance from my bosses and other people that are involved in that specific area. So
Yeah, I mean, Paul has answered it for us really. He said currently there's no change to the requirements. So Johnny, the April deadline will still stand, although we have this local lockdown. So please do bear that in mind when you are speaking to anybody that you're working with, i.e., landlords, etc. Regard to premature collapse of cables. Now, this is one of the questions that we actually had from the helpline, Mark. So we'll cover this one off now. If the cables above suspended ceilings have been secured, what about the 600 by 600 modular fittings that are sat inside the ceiling grid? Now, actually, I know a little bit about this, Mark, because before I joined NIC, I was working on a project where we was fitting, a large amount of these 600 by 600 fittings. The ones that we were actually fitting came with a catenary wire, and that catenary wire had to be either secured to the grid itself or to the rods and the ties that actually hold the grid up. Anyways, so I mean, manufacturer's instructions always do follow those because I'm sure they'll be put in the box if they are providing continuing wires to hold the fitting up, then obviously that's required to fit. Is there anything else you want to mention on that?
No, I think you kind of preempted it for me, really. I mean, often it depends on whether the ceiling has been designed as to be a proper fire compartment, or whether it's there just for decorative finish. But if those light fittings encroach on any escape route, then suitable provision will have to be made to stop them from prematurely collapsing. And you've mentioned, the common way for that is for wire, effectively.
Yeah.
Because that's what conventional lightweight ceiling grids are held up with anyway, is wire. So you would just connect onto the fixing that's there.
Yeah, somebody's mentioned here saying that they'd actually fit support wires when they're doing lay-in modulars. So yeah, again, I believe the manufacturer I was certainly doing the work. Well, their products, they actually came with the support wires as well. So another question: I've carried out an EICR where I recommended to change the consumer unit. I only carried out R2 on the initial EICR. Do I need to do an R1, R2 on the EIC once I've changed the consumer unit?
Well, I mean, the R2 method or the R1, R2 are there to achieve the same outcome, which is to confirm continuity of the CPC. So it's really a question it's really down to the person that's changing that fuse board to decide which method they're going to adopt, to be honest. Either will be sufficient because they're there to confirm continuity of the CPC. I mean, obviously, if you measure R1 plus R2, then that can be helpful with respect to measuring calculating ZS where that's relevant. So,
okay. Hopefully that's answered that one for you, Chris. I see that you're joining from YouTube. It'd be interesting to know how that platform's operating for you and whether it's something that you're enjoying as well. So please do get in touch with us that in regards to that. Could you use an RCD spur for bathroom lighting that has no supplementary bonding, as I've seen mentions that BS7671 doesn't cover the BS number for the types of devices, only covers BS4293, 61008 and 61009 for additional protection?
Yeah, that's right. It's that particular accessory isn't recognised as providing additional protection, so you could still use it, because at the end of the day, as long as it disconnects within 40 milliseconds at ×5, it will meet the requirement. It's just not specifically recognised at this moment in time by BS7671, so you'd probably have to list it as a departure, which is no less safe.
And would it be any less safe than doing it the typical route?
When you say the typical route, what do you mean?
If he wasn't using an RCD spur and he was protecting it by means of an RCD at the front end, maybe.
So yeah, an RCD at the front end would be fully compliant compared to your RCD spur. Obviously, it's down to the installer to determine the best method. It's just to be aware that currently it isn't recognised, as the caller pointed out. So, but it would, so you would list it as a departure. But the 18th edition does let you list departures, providing they're no less safe than if you were to use something that was compliant with BS 7671.
Okay, I think the questions are starting to slow down. So again, if you do have any questions, please do drop them into the comment section below, and we'll only be too happy to help. So we'll have a look at some of the questions that we've had come through from the helpline then, Mark. I've had a cinema client inquiry. So I've had a cinema client inquiry into the final sub-circuits, lighting and small power. Is there any reasons that LSZH white twin and earth cable wiring type cannot be used in cinemas?
There's no specific requirement in BS 7671 to use a specific cable. It's normally down to sort of client specification or design specification. There may well be some additional requirements for the local authority where there's sort of entertainment licenses and things that are issued,
Mm-hmm.
they may well have additional requirements that want, that specify the use of LSF or LS OH cables. The designer nevertheless should, if they deem that particular area there's additional fire risks associated with conditions of evacuation, then they should look at regulation set 422.
Okay.
Because there's particular requirements where there's additional risks to fire that are involved, where you've got perhaps large gatherings and the evacuation is difficult, for example. Okay.
Sorry, Matt Booker, I just scrolled up on the chat and I did see that you answered the question. You've actually repeated the question, so thank you for that. He said, got a Luden main board, then running a 10mm twin and earth cable as a sub-main to another Luden board, all RCBOs at the minute. Wanted a time delay RCBO upstream, but Luden don't make them. Can I use an MCB?
So it's a bit difficult without knowing the full sort of details of the installation. So this is let me get my head around this. So this is the main board, and there's a sub circuit coming off that feeding a second board.
I think it would be all down to his installation method in regards to how we can look at that if he doesn't need that time delayed RCBO upstream.
Are we talking about a TT earthing installation then, or?
Hasn't mentioned that. I guess he is looking more at selectivity if he's running RCBOs downstream of the 10mm twin and earth cable. So he's worried about the upstream taking out the downstream device.
It would depend on how the cable is installed. I mean, if it was buried at a depth of less than 50mm in the fabric of the building, then there's a requirement that you either provide earth metallic protection or you use an RCD. But clearly, a 30 milliamp RCD upstream wouldn't provide any discrimination for the final circuits downstream. So we try to discourage that. In that type of scenario, we try to discourage using a 30 milliamp RCD and come up with an alternative. If he was to use an armoured cable, for example, there'd be no requirement to provide RCD protection.
Yeah, someone else is commenting saying, if you're installing it needs mechanical protection to emit the RCD protection. All the questions are completely going off now, so we've got some activity in the chat. Richard has put, I've read that RCD sockets, spur sockets are only classed as supplementary protection and need an upstream protection via RCDs within BS 7671.
Well, again, as we said before, it will. In my experience of using them, they do give you a decent disconnection time. So there would be no requirement to provide specifically a 30 milliamp device upstream. That might lead to more complications, and it could lead to additional hazards for the user of that particular installation, perhaps. So it's down to the installer to decide on what the most appropriate method is.
Yeah.
Talk to the client because they may have specific needs.
Okay. The plot thickens on the 10mm twin and earth. He says it's TNCS but clip direct on surface.
So with a twin and earth clip direct on the surface, there's no requirement to provide RCD protection to that submain, providing it's not forming a TT earthing arrangement. So for TN systems, there's no requirement.
Okay. Hopefully that's answered that for you, Matt. Chris coming in with another one from YouTube. He's saying, if any ICR has been carried out on a public house and this board, say for example, the kitchen DB requires changing, where would be best to fit the SPD, Origin, kitchen DB, or both?
I mean, that's down to the installer's own assessment. I mean, it depends on things such as if there's a lightning protection system fitted, then the BS 7671 recommends a Type 1 at the Origin, and maybe a Type 2 at each separate distribution board. But don't forget there are limitations on the length of those circuits as well. To take into consideration.
Also, we've got to remember as well, if he's doing only if that DB only feeds a small part of that installation, but the rest of it's not protected, is he actually required at that point to fit an SPD?
If it's determined that he needs an SPD for his part of the installation to become compliant, then absolutely. But otherwise, it would be a further discussion with the client to bring it to their attention that the rest of the installation won't be protected, and perhaps they'll need to, recommend that a formal assessment is carried out to come up with a properly engineered solution to protect the rest of the installation, and then it will be up to the client then to decide how far they want to go with it.
Mm-hmm. Chris coming in with a question. Hi guys, if there is an external gas meter box with gas supply in plastic, but when entering the property in copper consumer side directly through the back of the meter box, would that require bonding?
So this is a gas meter with copper going through the...
Yeah, so it's being supplied in plastic, so the typical yellow pipe that we see being taken into a meter, but from the consumer side, it's then going into copper.
It depends on whether the point of the meter onwards, whether that does actually meet the definition of an extraneous conductive part. I mean, in theory, if it is proper plastic pipework supplying the meter, and the meter isn't in contact with true earth, then there would be no requirement to bond that copper pipe.
I think this one's where we'd be trying to do a test to quantify whether it's actually in contact with that general mass of earth, because it quite clearly, it could be introducing that potential into the property. It's copper, so it just needs that last one to constitute that extraneous conductive part.
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, if it's not, it'd be unlikely that it is fully plastic. Normally it's steel coated in plastic, isn't it? It's, I forget the name of the actual gas pipe itself, concertina, coming into the property. But he would need to determine that it's extraneous or not.
Yeah.
Coming in, conductive coming into the property, basically.
Lots and lots of questions.
And ideally, that test wants to be carried out with that gas pipe not connected to anything else. Yeah. When you're trying to determine that.
PVC single neutral with no CPC. What code for the EICR? Lots of properties have this. There's earth at every, or CPC at every light point, just not neutral single PVC, which is a live conductor.
So we're talking grey sheathed, single, neutral, black, the old 1960s properties, possibly. So this is run along the same route as the line conductor, perhaps, but just separate.
I would imagine it's being taken from point to point.
Yeah. So if it's single insulated, then it should be in conduit ducting or trunking, but by the sounds of it, it's got a grey sheath over it, so it's not single insulated, so it can run on its own, and ideally follow the same route as the line conductor.
I think this is down to that old saying, old thought where people say it's got to have a CPC at every point. As long as the CPC's at every point, it doesn't have to be necessarily encased within the neutral, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, the CPC it depends on whether you've got class 1 equipment. That becomes more important, doesn't it? Because the shock risk is higher, more onerous. So the fact that a neutral conductor is run on its own, but it's grey sheathed, so double insulated effectively. If in my view that doesn't make it dangerous, so it's a question of whether the inspector thinks that it should be improved. But just I say to contractors, just be mindful if you're going to issue a C3. If it's not electrically unsafe and there'd be no immediate benefit to upgrading those conductors to a twin and earth, then you could literally note it on the report and not necessarily give it a code. It just shows that then that you've considered it as the inspector.
Okay. Best Practice Guide 4 says that if a bathroom has no RCD or supplementary bonding, it's a code 2. If the light fitting was class 2, would you code it as a 3 or stick with 2? Sorry, I read that completely wrong. From my understanding, it's saying that a bathroom has no RCD or supplementary bonding, it's a code 2 in Best Practice Guide 4. If the light fitting was class 2, would you code it as a 3 or stick with code 2 in case the light fitting gets changed for class 1 in the future?
I mean, there's a requirement, whether the light fitting is class 1 or class 2, to provide supplementary bonding where it's required. I mean, not all bathrooms, require supplementary bonding. So, ultimately, it's for the inspector to work that one out, because if supplementary bonding isn't required and there's no RCD on the circuit, it may be that it's a C3 for lack of additional protection in that location.
Okay. Matt's just continuing his question about the twin and earth. He said, if it ran under the floor, would you recommend using armoured? And that's in reference to his 10mm.
This is on. Just remind me of the previous question. What was this? The sub main for the board.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it depends. The installer, it's down to the installer to work out the most appropriate method, because even if it's under a suspended floor, if you've got access to clip those cables to the joist under the floor, then why would you need SWA cable? Yeah. If it was likely to become damaged under the floor, then perhaps you'd use the SWA cable as a safer option.
If main water stopcock is outside the property and enters through a concrete floor, then into the house under the wooden floor, approximately 3 metres from the stopcock, should I just bond under the floor at point of entry, though it is not particularly accessible?
I think, I think that the person that's asked that question has kind of almost answered it themselves. It is about accessibility, because if it's, if there's copper coming out of the wooden floorboards, which is, been in contact with true earth under the floor, then there'll be a requirement to bond it where it's accessible. If the end users of the installation can come into simultaneous contact between, with that and another extraneous conductive part or an exposed conductive part.
Okay. At what point in domestic setting would a Type A RCD be used? For example, if the client has USB sockets, for example. A few examples there.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, it will depend on the level of any DC currents that are likely to appear on that installation as a result of the accessories that are being used or the loads that are being used in that installation. So it's one of those, isn't it? I mean, washing machines, typically new washing machines that have got variable speed drives could have an element of DC current on them and voltage. So
I mean, we did a presentation not so long ago back at Tech Talks about RCDs, and a lot of people found it very useful, because in the regs it gives a list of what you would typically see on a AC RCD, an A RCD, an F RCD, or a B RCD. So it gives a few lists of examples, and it says that if you don't have on a Type AC, if you don't have the standards, the filament lamps and all the other bits and pieces or storage heaters, etc., if they're not in the installation, but you've got other things, they're saying use a Type A RCD. I think it really boils down to you as the designer of that installation to say, it actually, it's not a typical installation anymore, so it doesn't warrant using a Type AC. I think as soon as you see some sort of switch mode power supply, or you've seen sort of USB sockets or at them variable speed drivers that you mentioned there, Mark, I think that's at that point there you would then say, do you know what, it's not being used the way I'd need to see it for an AC RCD.
Yeah, I mean, there's we've got two pocket guides, haven't we, 28 and 29, that give it further information on. Well, pocket guide 28 gives information on the application of residual current devices. Pocket guide 29 classifies the different types. You know what each type will protect against or detect against, if you like.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Doing a EICR on an installation. This is pretty much all the calls we're getting in at the minute is EICRs, PRS, EICRs. But this one's actually, to change the tune a little bit, Mark, is an industrial installation. And some new disc boards have been supplied using SY cable, which isn't covered under BS 7671. And also the glands used are not earthing the strands on the outer sheath. They use plastic dome type glands. Which codes would you recommend for the gland usage, and also the current carrying capacities, easy for me to say, of the SY cable determination?
I mean, again, it's one of those. It's down to the inspector, isn't it? I mean, we can give a bit of guidance. The steel strands in the SY cable, they're not. We don't consider those to be an exposed conductive part. The SY cable doesn't perform the same functions as an SWA. It relies on double or reinforced insulation. It's got a thicker outer jacket on the actual cable itself. The caller's quite right about the reduction in operating voltage. The steel strands are used primarily for sort of shielding, where you've got perhaps machine control signals and things like that used for that cable.
But it's not there for mechanical protection, is it?
It's not there for mechanical protection. No. The double jacket does that. It's highly resistive against abrasion, so being dragged along the floor or caused by vibrations generally. So it's one of those. If the inspector doesn't deem it an electrical safety issue, but rather just a non-compliance with the 18th edition, then and they want to see it improved, then they may want to issue a C3. However, it might just be worth recording as a note. Again, it's one of those. It's weighing up the benefits of replacing that SY cable. And
we did a fantastic webinar last week, myself and Sam from the technical helpline, and Martin Allen of ESF, and Sam actually made a really good point, Mark. He said sometimes if you had a blank canvas and you went into that job, it's not the way you would do it, but is it unsafe for continued use?
And that's what we're trying to assess against whenever we're condition reporting. Our first question to ourselves is what I'm observing an electrical safety issue? I mean, I've been into lots of installations that they look like a real dog's dinner, quite frankly, but when you start testing them from an electrical safety point of view, they're actually okay. So that's the question that we all need to be asking ourselves when we're carrying out condition reports. Am I looking at a safety issue here? I mean, the cables themselves, they're made to a German standard, which in itself isn't a lesser standard. It's perfectly suitable for other applications.
Okay.
That's it really.
Lots of questions coming in. With an external oil boiler, would I bond the oil pipe externally to the property? It's saying by or in the boiler, or would I bond the central heating flow and return instead, as the oil pipe itself doesn't actually enter the property? So I guess he's got an external, as he's mentioned there, external oil boiler in some sort of shed or outbuilding, but the flow and returns enter the building. Well, at which point does he bond it?
I think his first port of call is to test that oil supply to see if it is actually an extraneous conductive part. If it's in contact with true earth, then it might be that he needs to bond the flow and return pipes. I mean, it's quite common in sort of communal buildings where you've got heating, flow and return pipes travelling through the various bed sits or the various apartments, that they'll need to be bonded locally within those boards, within those rooms or bed sits or flats. But he really needs to determine if the oil pipe is in contact with true earth anywhere, to be honest. But like the previous question on that, to be able to test that pipe work, first of all, you'll need to carry out a visual inspection, but that might be combined with some physical testing to determine if it is naturally earthy, as we say. In which case, if it's naturally earthy, then it may be a good idea to bond the flow and return pipes. I mean, there'll be earth through the CPC of the boiler circuit, but it's the same principle with the bonding. You need to determine whether it is naturally earthy in its own right. So without those questions are always very difficult to give a full answer, because we're not able to go and visit that installation.
Someone else has asked a question here. I'm going to probably reword it to what I think will get us the correct answer here, Mark. When we're testing type AC RCDs, do we need to have a multifunction tester or an RCD tester that specifically tests type A RCDs, or can we use any tester to test them?
They'll need to check with the manufacturer's instructions, because a lot of the existing meters out there won't be able to test the type A RCD. They'll have to obviously check their own instrument to see what types of RCDs that checks, that tests. But other than that, they'll need to contact their instrument manufacturer. The requirement is to check the RCD in terms of additional protection, isn't it? So, you know, the requirement there is to test it at least 5 times or greater than. Some manufacturers use the 250 milliamp rule, which is born out of the product standard. And they'll say that it's got to be tested at least at 250 milliamps. But it really boils down to the instrument manufacturer to see whether their instrument, you know, their existing instrument can test it.
Mr. Collins has just mentioned here that Pocket Guide 41 in around extraneous conductive parts is the Pocket Guide and the go-to one there, Mark. Have you got the actual title of that Pocket Guide?
Yeah, I have. Identification of extraneous conductive parts.
Yeah, so that's for the guys. Yeah, for the guys that are asking in there as well. Last question then before we start wrapping things up. When changing a board in a property that has Eco7 supply to one of the boards for heating, do both new boards need to have SPD fitted? If you've only just joined us, Ian, we have touched on this, but we'll mention it again. Do both new boards actually need to have SPDs when they're being changed?
Well, I mean, it is an assessment. I mean, we don't believe that domestic properties per se require, you know, SPD protection. It's really down to you know, the installer sort of making the client aware, giving them the option if they want to have it installed. So there isn't, unless that, you know, the installation has got lots of expensive equipment in it, that might be a good reason to recommend to the client that it should have SPD protection. There is guidance, I think, on the BEMA website regarding the sort of value of the installation. You know, if the value of the installation is sort of more than 15 times the cost of an SPD, then that might be justification enough to put some in. But really, it's a question of making the client aware, and they could let the client make the decision.
And again, I know you mentioned BEMA guides there as well. We've got a couple of fantastic articles on SPDs as well. So you can, if you are a member with us, you can sign into your secure part of the websites, whether that's NIC, EIC or Alexa, and then you can go to the portal and search for the technical article of that. Steve just mentioned, and going on above here, just saying that the on-site guide discourages the use of SY cable, as the cable is not BASIC approved. If you look at the data sheet on Cleveland Cable website for SY cables, it says not for 230 volt circuits. So yeah, if you do want to choose to use SY cable, you can do so. However, you do need to make sure that you are putting that down as a departure, because as it currently stands, we are unaware of any cables that comply to the British standard at the moment, and we certainly haven't seen any coming through. I know there was manufacturers out there that were trying to get it passed through, and I'm sure they will do at some point. But up until then, you do need to be putting that down as a departure.
I mean, they can check the basic website as well to see if there's been any recent approvals for SY cable. That could be a good place to start.
Yeah. Okay, a lot of people saying well done. Thank you for the praise, and hopefully it's been informative to you guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next Monday if you are joining us on these platforms. However, we do have a webinar coming up this week, which is on Wednesday. Again, it's on EICR Coding Clinics. Again, stuttering me words. EICR Coding Clinic, that will be on Wednesday from 8 p.m, so same time as this, just on Wednesday. There will be a link being put up onto all the social media platforms, and you'll be probably notified via email as well. So please do join us. Not sure who's with me yet. Is it going to be yourself or is it going to be Sam? Do we know?
Not sure actually. That's TBC, to be confirmed.
Yeah, to be confirmed. Thank you, Katie, for the great job as always, chaps. She always likes to put a little comment on there and watching me do my work, so bless her. But for now, myself and Mark, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you from everybody at NIC and EIC and Alexa for all your support, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Cheers, thank you.